Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to the Honors Colloquium tonight. My name is Jay Walsh. I'm the Executive Director of URI AEUP, which is the full-time faculty union here on campus. I'm very excited to introduce Mark Levinson tonight. After the election last Tuesday, Mark ran to Jerry Hudson's office and said, please, please, please let me go to URI and speak instead of you, because I know how fantastic it's going to be. So we're lucky to have Mark take the Amtrak up from New York to here today. I'm just going to say a little thing as a preface to Mark's comments. It's no secret to people in the room or people who are union members, who are family members that are union members, that the history of unions has been strong in some areas and secured very important rights for workers and for people who are not part of collective bargaining units. But in other areas, unions have had checkered pasts. And the times that we're in right now, I think it's really important for communities and unions to come together, take stock of those checkered pasts, and find ways to make commitments. And for those of you who are on campus here, know that I'm committed to being able to do that regardless of what the history has been in other unions in the history of the United States over time. So I hope that the students' efforts today lead to other discussions and efforts around campus, and that we can bring all the different communities together on campus to resist and move forward together as a community. Mark Levinson is the Chief Economist of SEIU. He lives in Manhattan, and he received his PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research. Prior to working at SEIU, he worked as the Chief Economist for Unite Here and Unite, and was the economist for UAW in Detroit. He also worked for AFSCME in New York City before doing that. His writings on economic policy, the global economy, and labor rights have been published in the New York Times, The Nation, The American Prospect, Dissent, where he's also the book review editor, the New Labor Forum, and Boston Review. In 2002 and 2003, Mark was a Revson Fellow at Columbia University. In 2005-2006, Mark was the co-director of the Economic Policy Institute's Agenda for Shared Prosperity. Please welcome Mark Levinson to the stage.
Thank you. I'm an economist, so I have to start with a story. I've been in the labor movement for over 30 years, but I sometimes teach economics in colleges. And when you teach, you get student evaluations. The last time I taught, a young woman, wrote in her evaluation. She said, "Dr. Levinson, if I had 5 minutes to live, I would choose to spend it in your class." I was like, wow. And then it went on to say, that way it would seem like forever. So, hopefully that's not your experience tonight. Now, a week ago, it seems like a lot longer ago, when the returns were coming in, I remembered the story. Things were looking bad. And I remember this story of famous British naval genius, Lord Nelson. Lord Nelson was with his men at sea one day, and the lookout yelled, "Lord Nelson, 2 enemy ships on the starboard side." Lord Nelson turned to his assistant and said, "Sir, bring me my red pants." Bring him his red pants. They engage the enemy ships. They're victorious. About a week later, they're still at sea, and the lookout yelled again, "Lord Nelson, 6 enemy ships on the starboard side." Lord Nelson turned to his assistant and said, "Sir, bring me my red pants." Bring him his red pants. They engage in battle with the enemy ships. Again, they're victorious. At the end of the battle, the aide asked Lord Nelson, he said, "Why is it every time before we go into battle, you ask for your red pants?" And Lord Nelson patiently explained, in the unlikely event he were to be injured, his men would not see his blood, and they would continue to fight on to victory. The aide was awed by this bit of tactical brilliance. A few days later, they're still at sea, and the lookout yelled like he had never yelled before. 50 enemy ships ahead, 50 in the rear, 50 on the starboard side, 50 on the port side. And Lord Nelson turned to his assistant and said, "Sir, bring me my brown pants." That's kind of where we're at. Now, I want to start with a question. We have to start with a question. How is it that a candidate who the vast majority of Americans don't like, if you believe exit polls, and consider dishonest, lacking the temperament and the experience to lead the country, with the endorsement of one major newspaper in the whole country, disowned by his own party establishment, including many of the billionaires who sat out this campaign, whose campaign was outspent and outorganized, his tax dodges exposed, a video documenting his predatory sexual boasts was seen by millions, so clearly unfit for office, a foul, boorish cad, racist, misogynist, who has insulted a majority of the voters and embarrassed the remainder. How could this person defeat Hillary Clinton, whatever we think of Hillary Clinton, and we're going to come to some criticisms later, one of the most experienced and prepared presidential candidates in history? This is a profound question. Now, one explanation is that many voters are racist and sexist, and that's true. American politics is still stained by racism and sexism. And the fact that a majority of Americans twice gave their votes to Barack Obama doesn't change that fact. But what's missing from that explanation is an accounting for the populist anger that has rolled both parties in this election. Americans are suffering through the second economic recovery, the so-called good times, when most people are still losing ground. The middle class is getting hollowed out, good jobs are scarce, the banks blew up the economy, got bailed out, the richest among us pocket most of the rewards of economic growth. To omit this is to miss the entire context of this election. Trump won because, like Obama in 2008, as unlikely as this seems, he became a voice for change in a country desperate for it. Hillary Clinton came to, fairly or unfairly, came to personify the establishment and campaigned on continuity. Trump, the billionaire buffoon, presented himself as the quintessential outsider, and Clinton was not able to put forward a compelling vision of fundamental change. As just a week before the election, she told an interviewer in the New Yorker, "We have been fighting out elections in general on a lot of non-economic issues over the past 30 years. We haven't had a coherent, compelling economic case." This isn't about gridlock. It's about policies that have been supported by both parties: global trade agreements, tax deals by and for the corporations, financialization, Wall Street bailouts, big money politics, crony capitalism, worker organizations decimated, decades of promises not kept. Now, in our union, we have committed to stand with people of color, women, immigrant communities, Muslims. We are headed into 4 years of fierce battles over reactionary policies and choices on immigration, on Supreme Court justices, voting rights, and more. But we need a political response. And that's what I want to, in part, talk about tonight. When a political party suffers a defeat like this, it can react in two different ways. One way is what the Democrats under Bill Clinton did in the 1990s. in the Reagan era. What did they do? They passed NAFTA. They deregulated the economy. They said the era of big government is over. They focused on balanced budgets. They did little to help unions. That's one response. Another response would be to answer Trump's fake calls for change, to understand the populist anger that gave rise to Trump, and to double down on a real economics that speaks to working and poor people. And that's what I want to focus on tonight. Now, I want to do three things. I want to tell the story, the economic story of how we arrived at this moment. Because this is actually not just about this election or just about this campaign. This has been 40 years in the making. And I want to go over some of that history. And in doing so, I want to pay special attention to race and the economy. That's first. Secondly, I want to look at what happened, and I want to look at these epochal trends that existed in the U.S. economy that led to the crisis in 2008. First. Secondly, I want to look at what happened after the crash of 2008. And Obama, who in many ways was a very impressive president, but when it came to the economy, he made some crucial mistakes. And how did we account for the fact that after the crisis of 2008, the largest crisis of capitalism since the Great Depression, essentially nothing changed until this election. And it didn't change for the better. How do we account for that? And third and finally, what would it mean to offer a real alternative? What would it take to break out of the economic policies that has led to the second Gilded Age and to Donald Trump? I just want to say before I go on, there's a table in the back, and if this election and this outcome has motivated you to get involved, there's SEIU folks in the back have a table. Chaz is raising his hand back there. Please sign up. They'd be more than happy to get you involved. So first thing, to understand this story, we have to go back 40 years. And if you look at what happened to family income in the 40 years, or not the 40 years, I'm sorry, in the 25, 30 years after World War II, family income in this society rose equally. We used to say a rising tide lifts all boats. When the economy grew, everyone grew with it. So this just divides the population by quintiles. The poorest 20% to the richest 20%. And this is the increase in family income from 1947 to 1979. And interestingly, you see, actually the poorest 20% income actually went up more than the top 20%. There's a kind of period of equitable economic growth, shared prosperity. Starting in 1979, what happened? Much different pattern of growth. First of all, incomes increase much more slowly. But if you're the bottom 40%, your incomes actually decline. And the richer you are, the more your incomes go up. So you see this pattern of unequal growth. But to see where the growth really went, you can't just look at the top 20%. You have to look at the top 1%. Huge increase from 1980 to the present. And even the top 1% doesn't capture where the real money went. The top 1/10 of 1%, the very wealthiest people in the society, had off-the-chart income growth. This was something new in the society. We hadn't seen this level of inequality, really since the 1920s. So something seemed to happen right around 1980 when the way the economy functioned changed. We're going to look at a number of indicators that show the same thing. If you look at the share of income held by the wealthiest 1%, you see something really interesting. Right before the Great Depression, in 1928, right before the Great Depression, the wealthiest 1% owned almost a quarter, was able to capture almost a quarter of all the income. And then you have the New Deal, Roosevelt, the growth of the CIO, unions grow in strength, and the share of income held by the top 1% declines for decades. And then it's kind of flat for decades. And then right around that same turning point, late 70s, early 80s, right around when Ronald Reagan is elected, that line starts to turn around. Top 1% gets more and more of the income. In 2007, right before the crash, interestingly enough, the top 1% captures about the identical amount of income that they did the year before the Great Depression in 1928. If we now shift to workers' wages, hourly compensation, and you look at the relationship between wages and productivity, you see that from the end of World War II to the mid-70s, these lines are identical. Productivity goes up, wages go up. And this was, true for 25, 30 years. Back when I was an undergraduate taking economics class, one of the things they would teach you in economics is that wage growth depends on productivity growth. Wages track productivity. These two things start to become unconnected. Right again, same time period. Productivity continues to increase, wages go flat, become stagnant. Now, I'm going to come back to this later. This is a very important idea. It has to do with power, about the ability of workers to capture their share of productivity increases. There's nothing natural about the fact that wages will track productivity. This growth in inequality means a lot for families. So for a typical middle-class family, just since 1980, the growth in inequality, if we had the same structure of inequality we had in 1980, if we had the same structure today, every middle-class family would have about $18,000 a year more in income. So, this is a huge redistribution from the bottom and the middle, to the very top. And it means a lot for individual families. This is just, again, showing a different indicator of the same change. If you look at, this is the distribution of income growth during expansions. So forget recessions. We're just looking at, quote, the good years. And this breaks down different economic recoveries. And from World War II to the present, every recovery, less and less goes to the bottom 90%. That's the blue line. The red line is the amount of income that goes to the top 10%. So whereas in the current recovery, for the first time, this is actually a few years old. This actually changed in the last year or so. Incomes just started to go up a little bit for workers and the middle class. But for most of this economic recovery, all of the gains went to the top 10%. And again, you can see the big difference from 1980 on, compared to the post-war period. This just shows the distribution of income in the United States compared to other countries. The dark blue line is the bottom 90%. The amount of income that goes, the percent of the income that goes to the bottom 90%. And then, the orange line is what goes to the top 1%. The U.S. has a much more unequal distribution of income than any of these other industrialized countries. And not by a little, but by quite a bit. These changes in the economy, which affected everyone, but also have to be looked at how they affect people differently. And this is what we in the union call structural racism. How is it that blacks experience the economy differently than everyone else? And there's different ways to look at this. This is just, one indication. In the past 40 years, there's only been 1 year in which black unemployment fell below 8%. Only 1 year where it fell below 8%. While in the past 40 years, there's only been 4 years in which the white unemployment rate exceeded 8%. That is to say, the black community lives in a perpetual state of economic depression. Another thing, quite striking, if you look at the distribution of wealth, and this is really kind of unbelievable. Black families where the head of households has a college degree, black families where the head of household has a college degree, have less wealth than white families where the head of household is a high school dropout. So when we say, if we think, well, if we can equalize education, that's going to solve all these problems. Not necessarily. This is, and again, this is looking at wealth. So this takes account of not just your yearly income, but your assets, particularly housing. And decades or a century of housing discrimination against blacks is what mostly accounts for this. But this is quite striking. This is a little complicated. There's a lot going on in this graph, but let me quickly explain this. This shows the type of neighborhood that people live in. The top two bars on these graphs, the black and the dark gray, are what are called high poverty neighborhoods. These are neighborhoods where the poverty rate is 20% or higher. And this looks at different generations, two different generations of blacks and whites. So the first bar is for people 47 to 62 years old. And for blacks between 47 and 62 years old, 62% of all blacks live in high poverty neighborhoods. And you look at the younger generation, 17 to 32-year-olds, it's actually gotten worse. 66% of blacks live in high poverty neighborhoods. And compare that to whites. Only 4% of whites, 4 to 5% of whites live in high poverty neighborhoods. So even middle class blacks live in what are called high poverty neighborhoods with less health care, fewer services, substandard schools often. So again, structural racism, how it's experienced in the economy. Now, how is this, the trends that I've talked about before, change the way the economy functions? What this shows every business cycle up until Ronald Reagan since World War II. And the lines just show the decline is the percent of job loss and how many months the job losses last. And then it shows the economic recovery. And notice up until 1981, some are deeper than others, some are, but they all have the same shape. There's kind of a V shape. Economy goes into recession, and then it recovers. Starting in 1990, the first recession after Ronald Reagan is in office, it's not a very deep recession, but it takes a long time for the jobs to come back, much longer than before. People started to notice this at the time. Then you look at the next recession under the young George Bush. Again, not a very deep recession, but it takes an even longer time for the jobs to come back. You start to hear this talk of a jobless recovery. And remember, this is the era when inequality is growing. More money is going to the top. There seems to be less demand in the economy to drive the economy. Then you have the recession of 2008. Much bigger than anything we've had before, and takes a long, long, long time for the jobs to come back. So these trends are not just affecting inequality, they're affecting how the economy works and generates jobs. So even today, 7 years into an economic recovery, and we're 7 years into a recovery now, the official unemployment rate's 4.9%. However, that doesn't count a lot of people. There are almost 15.5 million people who are either officially counted as unemployed, working part-time but who want full-time jobs, or who aren't counted as officially unemployed even though they want jobs because they haven't looked during the survey period. If you are not actively looking for a job, you're not counted as unemployed, even if you want a job. So the labor slack in the economy is much greater. The amount of joblessness is much greater than the official unemployment rate indicates. One way to look at that, if you don't look at the unemployment rate, but you look at what's called the employment to population ratio, the percent of employed as a percent of the population, you see a big decline after the crisis in 2008, and then we're not anywhere near back to where we were before the crisis. And if you compare this with other recoveries, the bottom line is the current recovery. We're not back to where we were before. Other recoveries at this time, way surpassed the period before the recession. So the economy continues to function very, in a subpar manner. Now, the last year or so, things have actually gotten a little better. This just looks at the change in average household income every year, and you see in 2015, the most recent year where figures are available, you actually had one of the largest increases in the recent past. It was the first time in years. You look at all the 6-7 years before that, there was actually negative growth. The economy actually has finally started to turn around a bit. And if, again, you look at the last year, now this is just 2014-15, and you look at income growth by percentile. So that's the poorest 10%, that's the 90th percentile is the richest 10%. And you see the income growth has actually been greater at the bottom. Now, part of this is the success of things like the Fight for 15, which has raised wages at the bottom. But so just in the last year or so, this has started to turn around. But it doesn't even begin to make up for all of the bad years before. So, in the decade between 2002 and 2013, wages were either stagnant or fell for the bottom 70% of all workers. And that included people with college degrees. This just shows that, again, the unequal increase in the change in wages. The top line shows the top 10% since 1980. So in 2015, the wages for the very top reached an all-time high. For the bottom 90%, you see a small tick up, but it's basically been flat for, almost 20 years. I'll just skip this. This just... we've had some success in our union with the Fight for 15, and one of the arguments against the Fight for 15 was, well, you're actually going to hurt the very workers you're trying to help, because if you raise wages in low-wage sectors, the number of jobs are going to decline. This shows that for states that this compares states that raised minimum wages since 2013 with states that didn't. And you see the states that raise the minimum wage actually have higher earnings growth and actually higher jobs growth than the states that didn't. And this is looking in two low-wage sectors, the leisure and hospitality sector. Now, so this period of stagnation in the economy, what accounts for it? It's not just one thing. It's a whole web of policies that have really been enacted by both parties. And, we call it boxing workers into the corporate agenda. And there's different components to this, but they all work together to squeeze wages. Part of it is corporate-dominated globalization. NAFTA, CAFTA, Peru, TPP, the World Trade Organization, outsourcing. It's a globalization that really works in the interests of multinational corporations, not for workers. It's this, idea that we have to get government out of the way, privatization, deregulation, tax cuts for the wealthy, cuts in public services, austerity, a focus on deficit reduction rather than full employment, high unemployment, slow growth. a tax on unions. Goes under, the polite name for it is labor market flexibility. It's really about union busting, a tax on workers' rights. All of these policies together are what explain the trends that I've been talking about. There's an alternative to this, and it's basically the opposite of every one of those policies in the box. I just want to focus on several here. It means empowering workers. It means the focus of government policy should be on full employment that meets social needs. I'm going to talk about some of these components later. It means about raising wages. It means a pro-worker globalization. This is the pro-worker agenda that we need. And let's just run through this quickly. If you look at the relationship between unions and shared prosperity, the blue line shows the growth and decline of unions compared with the growth, decline, and then growth again of inequality. The red line is the share of income going to the top 10%. So when unions are very weak in the 20s, that's the Gilded Age. A lot of inequality. All the income's going to the top. Then you have Franklin Roosevelt, the growth of the CIO, the New Deal. Union membership grows. When union membership grows, the amount of income going to the top actually declines. Then there's like a 30-year period of stability. Unions are actually declining a little. There's a relative period of stability. Then when unions really start to decline, the blue line, the inequality starts to increase again. If you look at another way to measure union strength, the percent of workers covered by collective agreements. The U.S., an outlier internationally. 13% of workers are covered by collective agreements. In many other countries, even where unions may be weak, their laws allow for industry-wide bargaining. Unions are covered by collective agreements. It leads to a much more egalitarian society. This just shows the, as a result, the corporate profits, the blue line, compared to labor's share of income. Labor's share of income is going down. Corporate profits are going up. This is a question of power. Workers have lost power. Policy needs to empower workers. Full employment. This graph shows government's contribution to either growing or slowing the economy. This is federal, state, and local government. And just focus on the period after 2008. The crisis hits. The blue lines going up shows the effect of government policy. Government is pumping money into the economy. The economy is growing, or at least the government is inducing growth, starting way too early. And this was one of Obama's big mistakes. He pulls back what was the very successful stimulus. President Obama really stopped the recession from turning into a Great Depression. And then way too early, he pulled back. Way too worried about deficits. And then you see for years, the government is actually slowing the economy when unemployment is very high. And it's only in the last year or so that government is again barely starting to grow the economy. And so government policy has really failed here to create the kind of jobs that it started to do and then changed. Now, I'm going to talk in a minute about infrastructure investment. And one reason the government claims they haven't done as much as they should be doing is, the debt would be too high. The debt doesn't matter so much. What's relevant is what is the interest that a government has to pay on the debt. And right now, and for years, the interest payments on the debt as a percent of our economy are way below what they've ever been. The government can essentially be borrowing money for free to build roads, parks, sewer systems, energy grids, the infrastructure in this country that is falling apart. This is an incredible missed opportunity. Donald Trump said, Donald Trump says he's going to do something about it. He's going to do it in the wrong way. We'll talk about that in a minute. The failure of the government to invest heavily has resulted in, if you look at government spending compared to the last 4 business cycles, under Obama, it's way below. Way below. This is supposed to be a liberal president, and yet he's implementing, in fact, a very conservative economic policy. Now, to be fair, it's not just Obama. He was constrained by a reactionary Congress after 2010. So let's not forget that. But if you look at how this played out, if you look at private sector job growth, that's just growth in the private sector, and you compare the Obama record to other presidents, I mean, he's kind of in the middle of the pack, better than both Bushes, kind of right in line where the Reagan economy was. That's private sector job growth. But the big problem has been in the public sector. Public sector job growth in this recovery has never recovered. And this is largely a state and local phenomenon. State and local governments have been squeezed. And public sector employment under Obama is much less than it was under Reagan or George Bush. And most people don't realize this. And this accounts for a lot of the slowing of the economy. It's happened in the public sector. And the extent of this is huge. If government spending followed the Great Recession's end, tracked spending that followed the recession of the early 1980s, we would be spending an additional $1 trillion today on social needs, infrastructure, creating thousands and tens of thousands, if not millions, of jobs. This is a failure of economic policy. I'm going to skip this. This just shows the infrastructure needs. The American Society of Civil Engineers every year publishes a report on the infrastructure needs in this country. And this shows the estimated funding in these various areas and the funding gap. In every area, we have a huge funding gap. We are way underinvesting in infrastructure. At the same time, we have a huge employment problem. We can meet the employment problem and meet our social needs. And we've had this period of extremely low interest rates. There's no reason why this hasn't been increased by billions of dollars. And this decline in infrastructure spending is happening in state and local governments. It's happening in the federal budgets, happening at all levels of government. But it's not just infrastructure where we need to create good jobs. We need public investment to meet social needs, child care, home care, green energy. In fact, when Clinton in this campaign had an infrastructure plan, Trump's was much bigger. Clinton's should have been much bigger. And it shouldn't just be focused on infrastructure. It needs to be focused on the care sector. In fact, this graph looks at the number of jobs created for each $1 million in spending, comparing construction to home health care services, nursing care, family services, child care. The green line is the total number of jobs created. The blue and red are direct and indirect jobs created. But you see much higher job creation in the care sector. And again, this should be a government responsibility. This is the kind of policy we need to respond to workers' needs. Now, in all of these areas, Trump I believe, will be a disaster. He's not going to empower workers. He's not going to create the kind of domestic care jobs we need. He is talking about investing in infrastructure. That will be a good thing if he does, although the way he's going to do it, I think, is the wrong way. It's going to be based on a lot of privatization. It's going to be private money, which will be underwritten by the government. It's going to be huge tax cuts for the wealthy, which is going to increase inequality here. So, he could, in the short term, actually stimulate the economy if he does a big enough infrastructure program. But his massive tax cut program, which is going to be a giveaway to the rich, is going to worsen these trends towards inequality. And there's going to be massive cutbacks in social programs. So we're, coming into a rough period. Oops. So I want to just end with two thoughts. One is this quote from A. Philip Randolph, the great African-American trade union leader. At the banquet table of nature, there are no reserved seats. You get what you can take and you keep what you can hold. And if you can't take anything, you won't get anything. And if you can't hold anything, you won't keep anything. And you can't take anything without organization. We need to build unions, community organizations. We need organization. And again, I urge you to sign up at the back to get active here. And I want to end by just reading an excerpt from a poem by the great African-American poet Langston Hughes. This is called Let America Be America Again. And in this moment, it was written in a very different context, but in this moment, I think it's very apt. Let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let it be the pioneer on the plain seeking a home where he himself is free. America never was America to me. Who said the free? Not me, surely not me. The millions on relief today, the millions shot down when we strike, the millions who have nothing for our pay, for all the dreams we've dreamed, for all the songs we've sung, and all the hopes we've held, and all the flags we've hung, the millions who have nothing for our pay except the dream that's almost dead today. Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet, and yet must be, the land where every man is free. Oh yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have 10 or 15 minutes for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Professor Johnson and I will be around with the microphones. We have a question here.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I know my question. I'm taken aback by what you've said. I knew some of that information, but not in its entirety, and it really hits me hard. So I'm just trying to gather my thoughts here, so forgive me. You mentioned that workers need to be empowered, so my question to you would be, how do we empower? I'm here representing a union at URI, so how do we empower our members? Your thought on that, please.
Well, and this obviously is not going to happen under a Trump presidency, although it could in some states. But workers have to be given the right to unionize. In this country, workers are effectively denied that right. They're denied that right by a law that allows employers to prevent workers from organizing in a way which is not allowed in any other country in the world. And one thing that I think a lot of us are very angry at Democrats over the years is that they haven't done enough to assist unions. You don't expect Republicans to. Democrats should, and they haven't done it. We haven't had labor law reform. We haven't had moves that would allow sectoral bargaining. We need new forms of work organization, but we have to strengthen unions. And unions have to do more to organize, but there's no magic bullet. We have to win it politically. You have to win it, shop by shop, but we also have to win it at the macro level. We need the right to organize.
Hi, I'm over here. Hi. Most recently, Iceland was extremely aggressive about attacking the bankers who stole money from their people. And yet, we just had the crisis with Wells Fargo, and you still had golden parachutes being given out, and there didn't seem to be any actual, as I could tell, punitive action taken against those at the top. And I'm just wondering, when is this paradigm going to shift?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And part of the anger, I think part of the populist anger, there's a lot of components to this. Part of the populist anger in this country was we have this enormous crisis in 2008, really brought on by not just irresponsible, criminal behavior by many in the banking sector. Not one banker went to jail. Not one. Meanwhile, millions of people lost their homes because of that criminal, behavior. This was happening around the country. And you're right, in Iceland, which was hit by the crisis very badly, they were one of the early countries that was hit, tons of bankers went to jail. There's actually, I can't remember the name of it, Michael Moore's last movie was on...
Where to Invade Next?
Yes, thank you. Where to Invade Next has this great segment where he goes to Iceland and he talks to the judges and he talks to the prosecutors and he goes to the jail where the bankers are. And he contrasts what happened in Iceland and what happened here. It's actually worth looking at.
Okay. Hello. So you had a graph up there of wage increases that were like from unions and wage increases in the same states that raised their minimum wage without unions, and both of them rose. And so I'm wondering if you know why that happens, or maybe if there's a confounding variable that causes that.
Yeah, well, this is looking at the leisure and hospitality sectors. Well, part of it, if millions of workers are getting wages, these are poor workers, they spend that money. Demand in the economy leads to more jobs. This is the basis of Keynesian economics. You want to grow the economy, you don't throw money at the rich and hope they invest it. That's not what you do. You raise wages at the bottom, you increase demand. In response to that demand, investment will come. And so part of what's happening, those states that raised the minimum wage had much higher earnings growth. And then you see they also had jobs growth. Now, it's not quite that simple. There's a lot of factors that go on. It could depend on what state we're talking about. Wages aren't the only thing that lead to increased demand, but it's an interesting correlation that rebuts a lot of the conventional wisdom about minimum wage increases. That minimum wage increases are going to lead to fewer jobs. It's not, recent research shows that that's not the case.
Well, I was listening to NPR this afternoon, and I heard a random comment that just really gave me pause. It said, in the United States, we give too much money to poor people. One of Trump's people said that. You know, I work in elder care, and I work with a lot of people, coworkers, who are not particularly well paid. And, you know, there's an element of racism, but there's also just this element of jealousy that they don't want to see their taxes going to other people who don't work as hard as they do. And I'm just so damn tired of hearing that. And I say, look, we're giving all the money to the people like Trump and his ilk, and you begrudge somebody a few bucks to keep their kids alive? Give me a break. But that's the ethic of the Trump voter, I really think. Now, how do we deal with it?
Well, no, that's a very serious question. There's Jared Bernstein, a friend of mine, said, there's kind of two visions of the economy. One is called what he calls yo-yo. You're on your own. And the other is we're all in this together. These are two very different, visions that we live. That you're on your own. Good luck. And the other is that we're part of a society. And how do we take responsibility for that society? How do we take responsibility for those, least fortunate, ill, and sick? We've fallen down in that area. And the idea that we give too much money, it's also just happens to be wrong. We give less than any other country. There was one graph I didn't show just because I was running out of time. Which showed compares all industrialized countries in the world, and it shows inequality before government spending, and then inequality after government spending. And before government spending, U.S. kind of all these countries are kind of bunched together. They have a kind of similar level of market inequality. But the final outcome, like what is the outcome after you put government in the picture? Every other government except the U.S., reduces poverty and inequality more, than the U.S. So the U.S. doesn't do more. The U.S. does less.
Hi, I'm a union rep, and I would love to be able to distribute, if you were to put together a brief, like a pamphlet of the main ideas, like to my stewards and to my union members, because I think this wasn't even being talked about 10 years ago, income inequality, and it's really, I just think we need to spread the facts about it as far as possible. I'm actually with SEIU. But if you had some kind of, I think our members would be very interested to talk about this stuff, read about it, and I don't know if that's something that you might do.
Yeah, no, education on these matters is extremely important because you have to fight the idea that there's no alternative. There are alternatives, and it's not inevitable that it happened. It was the intended outcome of a set of policies. And a very different set of policies would achieve a different outcome.
I think we have time for one more question. So this is the two more questions? Okay, sorry. So this is the second to last question tonight.
So you said earlier that part of the disaffection for Clinton was the perception that she really didn't represent the interests of workers. And as a former educator, I watched the two teachers' unions very quickly endorse Clinton during the race. And as it's come out that, part of Clinton's demise was her connection with Wall Street and corporate interests. My question to you is, what are the unions going to do to reframe themselves and to get themselves back in the game?
Yeah, look, We endorsed Clinton. SEIU endorsed Clinton. And I didn't say that Clinton didn't support workers. What I said is that Clinton ended up being seen as the representative of the establishment. At a time, when there's an enormous reaction against the establishment. Look, every political campaign, especially once you get in the general election, it's a question of what are the alternatives. Now we're going to find out very soon what the alternative was, because the alternative won, and it's not going to be pretty. Now, I was talking with people earlier. You know what I think of Trump. Trump will fail. Trump will not meet, the demands of the people who put him there. It's not going to happen. And then this is going to present an enormous opportunity for our side. And the question is, this is where I think I agree with you. We can't go back to where we were. We have to use this as a moment where, we are working on behalf of a much more serious, economic program for working people, where, where the choice is clear. For too long, Democrats have blurred this line. Yeah, we're going to, appeal to Wall Street, and we'll, appeal to, working people too. No. Now the problem is we're going to go through enormous damage, in the next few years. But I think this moment is going to change American politics, maybe forever. I thought the 2008 crisis, the 2008 crash, the largest economic crisis since the Great Depression, I thought that would change U.S. politics. It really didn't. But this, I think, is going to. This is going to be dramatic. And unfortunately, a lot of people are going to suffer before, we have a chance to fix it. But a lot of people who have been sitting this out, or a lot of people who are going to suffer, I think are going to react against this. And a lot of people are going to realize, who voted for Trump, that they bought a bill of goods, and he's a fraud. And, but I think politics is going to, be very different in this country.
All right, we have one more question.
Hi, I have I guess somewhat a broad question, but I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on it. Just sort of thinking about how sort of this climate of encouraging or telling all young people that they have to go to college as a way to guarantee higher wages or sort of a better job, and sort of your thoughts about how that might connect to empowering workers.
How it might connect to what?
To empowering workers,
yeah.
And sort of this conversation we've been having.
Well, no, there's an important connection and disconnection. We like to tell people, go to college. You have to go to college, and you should go to college, but go to college, and then you'll. But going to college is not enough anymore. In fact, I don't think I had it in these slides, but college-educated workers' wages have been stagnant and declining too. They haven't been growing. College education doesn't anymore guarantee you a rising standard of living. If you have a college degree, on average, you're going to do better than someone who doesn't have a college degree. So yeah, go to college. But you need more than that. So many college-educated workers, also need unions. Workers need collective power. An individual in this society by themselves has no power. And so yes, by all means go to college, but at the same time, and by the way, 2/3 of the workforce is non-college educated. And so, the majority, that may change a little, but it's not going to change a lot. So the majority of working people in this country do not have a college education. And, they can protect themselves, most importantly by having a union, and secondly, by supporting public policies that work in their interests. And by the way, those are connected. The stronger unions are, the more likely you're going to have a public policy, that works in the interests of all workers. And by the way, one very interesting paper just came out by the Economic Policy Institute that showed, one of the biggest gainers from the increase in unionization is non-union workers. When unions are strong in an industry, and when unions set the norm in the industry, many non-union employers have to meet that norm. They often will meet that norm in the hope that a union won't come in. But, so it's not just union members who benefit from unionization. The whole society benefits from strong unions. That's another message we have to get out more.
Okay, I want to thank Mark Levinson again.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Just a reminder, we have no speaker next week as it is Thanksgiving week, but in 2 weeks from today we have Professor Jelani Cobb, who recently went from UConn to Columbia. He'll be talking to us about Black Lives Matter, the criminal justice system, and how that relates to inequality.